Manhattan's skyline glittered like 1,000 fractured diamonds, reflecting the ambitions and vanities of those who inhabited its towers. At the center of it all, in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Evelyn Harper adjusted her designer gown, smoothing the silk over her hips as she glanced at the mirrored walls. She was 34, with a sharp elegance that spoke of both privilege and cultivated ruthlessness. Her reflection stared back at her with a blend of confidence and subtle arrogance, the kind that comes from knowing you have clawed your way to the top and intend to stay there. Her husband, Daniel Harper, leaned casually against the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun set over the city with a quiet intensity. 38, tall, with dark hair beginning to silver at the temples, he had the kind of presence that was easy to underestimate. People assumed passivity in his measured gestures and soft-spoken manner. Evelyn often joked, half in jest, half in truth, that he was the perfect accessory, elegant, dependable, unremarkable enough not to overshadow her. She was proud of him in her way, but prouder still of herself. Her empire of contacts, ventures, and the recently finalized $550 million deal she'd closed was proof that she was untouchable. Daniel's eyes followed her movements, noticing the minute adjustments in her posture, the flicker of tension in her jaw. He saw everything, not out of suspicion, but out of understanding. He had watched her navigate boardrooms and social galas with surgical precision, each laugh, each word measured to build influence. He had also learned to wait, silently, knowing the moment of truth would eventually arrive. "You're thinking about tonight's dinner party," Daniel said softly, not turning to face her. His voice was calm, almost hypnotic in its steadiness. Evelyn paused, smoothing a stray strand of hair. "Of course, it's an important crowd, venture capitalists, influencers, board members. I want to make sure everyone knows who's steering the ship." Her lips curved into a small, self-satisfied smile. Daniel finally turned, his hands tucked into his tailored trousers. "And you will. Just remember, appearances are everything, but substance is what people often overlook." There was no admonishment in his tone, only a quiet certainty, a subtle weight that seemed to settle in the room like gravity. She laughed lightly, dismissing the underlying warning. "Daniel, you worried too much. I've done this 100 times. This city bends to ambition, and I am ambition incarnate." He allowed her confidence to wash over him, as he always did, a silent observer in the theater of her life. But in the back of his mind, he cataloged every interaction, every subtle slight from the corporate elite that she hadn't noticed, every opportunity that could be leveraged. The city may bend to ambition, but it was a fickle partner. He had learned long ago that control often came from the quiet hand, not the waving one. The apartment doorbell chimed sharp and clear, pulling Evelyn from her reverie. "They're early," she murmured, eyes glinting with the thrill of social conquest. "Perfect." Daniel gestured toward the door. "Shall we?" They moved together toward the entrance. Evelyn's heels clicked on the marble floors, echoing through the expansive space. Daniel followed silently, his pace slower, deliberate. The doorman greeted them and the first guests began to trickle in, each one a carefully curated node in Evelyn's social network. Wine was poured, handshakes exchanged, laughter fluttered through the air, light as champagne bubbles, but carrying the weight of unspoken calculations. Throughout the evening, Evelyn shone. She commanded attention without raising her voice, her stories weaving through the room like silk threads, pulling people into her orbit. Daniel remained beside her, the ever-present anchor, occasionally interjecting with dry observation or a soft, strategic smile that left others puzzled. They watched her in awe, or so they thought, while he noted details that could shift fortunes. The juxtaposition was fascinating. She was the visible force, radiant and assertive, while he operated in shadows, gathering, measuring, weighing. By the time dessert was served, the penthouse hummed with applause and polite accolades. Evelyn basked in the adoration, leaning slightly on Daniel's arm as she laughed at an especially clever quip from a rising tech mogul. She glanced down at him and whispered, "You're boring, you know that." Her voice carried the playful bite of someone used to control. Daniel smiled faintly, without offense, "And you're overconfident, but it suits you." His eyes flicked briefly to the table of documents she'd been discussing earlier, the final contracts for her $550 million deal. "Remember, the world isn't always as it appears."
Evelyn didn't hear or refused to hear the warning beneath the words. Her focus was on the adulation, the feeling of power coursing like warm wine through her veins. Daniel knew she saw the city as her stage, the boardrooms as theaters, and the people around her as props. But he also knew the truth. She was dancing on a floor built by his own hands. As the night wound down, guests began to depart, leaving the couple alone once again. Evelyn, still flushed with triumph, turned to Daniel, eyes sparkling. "You know, everyone tonight thinks I'm untouchable." Daniel regarded her, silently, a half-smile playing on his lips. The city lights outside cast long reflections across the glass, distorting shadows into something both familiar and unknowable. "Untouchable," he murmured. "Sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one holding the keys." Evelyn laughed, brushing off his words as another wisp of caution she didn't need. She didn't notice the slight tightening of his jaw, the quiet weight of patience and calculation behind his calm exterior. And in that moment, the perfect image of the power couple remained intact. The world saw brilliance, charm, and control. But behind the silken smiles, the first threads of tension were quietly weaving a tapestry that neither of them could yet fully comprehend. That night, Manhattan sparkled like a city of promises and pitfalls alike. And in the penthouse high above, Evelyn and Daniel Harper maintained the flawless illusion of perfection. Yet, as with all illusions, cracks had already begun to form, as subtle as whispered secrets and silent observations, waiting for the right moment to expose the fragile truth beneath.
The Harper residence, a modern townhouse tucked into the Upper East Side, had been transformed for the evening into a stage of subtle power plays. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across the polished marble floors, bouncing off silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and delicate wine glasses. Guests, a curated mix of venture capitalists, tech influencers, and socialites, floating like currents, each aware that tonight was as much about networking as it was about performance. Evelyn moved among them with the ease of a predator in her element, her laughter a melodic weapon, her eyes sharp and calculating. Daniel lingered near the wine table, watching, his fingers brushing lightly against the corks of unopened bottles. He observed how the guests adjusted their posture around Evelyn, how they leaned closer when she spoke, nodding eagerly at her subtle boasts. His expression remained calm, almost imperceptibly amused. He had seen this scene unfold countless times, yet tonight the stakes felt slightly different. Perhaps it was the energy in Evelyn's gaze, bright, self-assured, untouchable. Perhaps it was the anticipation of witnessing the delicate moment when pride meets truth. Evelyn, sensing her audience, poured a glass of red Bordeaux and moved toward Daniel. Her heels clicked confidently across the floor, drawing attention without effort. She leaned close to him, her voice light and teasing. "Daniel, darling, you look stiff. Loosen up. People will think you're as boring as last year's portfolio report." Her laughter danced across the space, drawing the gaze of several nearby guests. Daniel smiled faintly, tilting his head. "I prefer measured impact over empty flamboyance," he replied quietly. His tone was gentle, but carried an undercurrent of control. Evelyn, either not perceiving it or choosing to ignore it, smirked and brushed past him, moving into the crowd. The night progressed, filled with polite conversation, subtle flirtations, and the occasional clink of champagne glasses. Evelyn was in her element, dazzling her guests with anecdotes from her recent business ventures, including the $550 million deal she had just finalized. She spoke with a mixture of pride and theatricality, painting herself as the indispensable architect of success, the woman whose vision had elevated countless projects. Daniel observed quietly, noting how easily people hung on every word, unaware that the foundation she praised were largely built upon his subtle interventions, his careful orchestration behind the scenes. As the dinner began, an elegant oak table, groaning under the weight of silverware and crystal goblets, became the arena for the evening's first test of social dynamics. Evelyn was seated at the center, Daniel to her right. The seating had been meticulously arranged to maximize her visibility and charm. She leaned forward, animatedly recounting a story about a high-stakes negotiation, gesturing with her wine glass. "And then," she said, her voice lilting with humor,
I looked him dead in the eye and told him, "This deal doesn't close without me." Her audience laughed appreciatively, the wine amplifying their indulgence.
Daniel's gaze lingered on her hand, noticing the delicate tremor as she set the glass down. The subtle sign of nerves or excitement was masked beneath the practiced elegance. He allowed the laughter to roll over him, unshaken. Inwardly, he cataloged every nuance, every movement, every look. The night was as much his as hers, though few would ever suspect. Then came the moment that would define the evening, though Evelyn could not yet see it. As she leaned back to emphasize her dominance in the story, her hand swept over Daniel's sleeve in playful exaggeration. The wineglass, still half full, tilted, and with a soft, red splash, the Bordeaux drenched Daniel's crisp white shirt. Gasps erupted around the table. Evelyn froze for a split second, a mix of surprise and delight flickering across her face. Then she laughed, high and sharp, a sound meant to cut and charm all at once. "Oh, Daniel, you look so helpless," she teased, her eyes glinting with amusement. The guests joined in, some nervously, some genuinely entertained by the display. Daniel stood motionless for a heartbeat, his expression unreadable, then smiled faintly, dabbed at the fabric with a napkin, and said in a calm voice, "It seems I underestimated your aim." There was no embarrassment in his tone, only a quiet acknowledgement, a subtle assertion of control beneath the apparent humiliation. Evelyn, oblivious to the deeper meaning, laughed again and turned to the guests, making light of the moment. She had no idea that the very deal she had celebrated hours earlier, the one worth $550 million, was controlled by the man standing silently in front of her, unshaken and observant. The conversation resumed, but the dynamics had shifted imperceptibly. Guests now glanced at Daniel with a mix of curiosity and confusion, sensing a depth they hadn't noticed before. Evelyn continued to dominate, but the room's energy carried a new, subtle tension, a reminder that control is rarely absolute. Daniel, ever the quiet architect, had not missed a single detail, and though he said nothing, the balance of power had already begun to tilt. As dessert was served, a delicate milfway paired with espresso, the laughter had softened, replaced by thoughtful murmurs. Evelyn chatted animatedly with a young tech investor, recounting the audacity of her latest negotiations. Daniel listened, contributing sparingly, each word measured and precise. The guests, accustomed to her brilliance and charm, were beginning to notice the quiet strength in the man they had assumed was secondary. By the time the evening concluded, the last of the guests had departed, leaving the couple alone in the expansive dining room. Evelyn, flushed from wine and the thrill of performance, turned to Daniel, her eyes sparkling. "Did you see how impressed they all were? I was magnificent." He studied her, his expression soft but intense. "Yes, magnificent. But remember, pride is often the first to be tested. The world sees brilliance, yes, but it rarely sees the strings that hold it together." Evelyn waved his words aside with a playful laugh, touching his arm lightly. "Oh, Daniel, you always speak in riddles. The world bows to those who shine, and tonight I shone the brightest." He let her confidence wash over him, though inside he catalogued the moment, noting the perfect storm of arrogance and underestimation. The game had begun in earnest, though she did not yet know it. And in that quiet, tension-filled aftermath, Daniel Harper remained calm, patient, and entirely aware that the most powerful moves are often made unseen long before the world catches up. Outside, Manhattan glittered in the night, indifferent to human drama, and the Harpers, one luminous, one quietly formidable, stood in the aftermath of performance and perception, each playing a part only partially understood by the other.
The morning after the dinner party, Manhattan awoke to a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of the city. Sunlight filtered through the half-drawn blinds of the Harper penthouse, cutting sharp lines across the polished hardwood floor. Evelyn Harper stood in the kitchen, sipping espresso, scrolling through the social media feeds that had already erupted with praises for her performance the previous night. Every post, every comment, every virtual applause was a testament to the power she thought she wielded so effortlessly. Daniel entered the kitchen quietly, his presence barely acknowledged.
He had already skimmed through overnight emails, flagged important correspondences, and silently noted discrepancies in some of the contracts Evelyn had boasted about. He placed a folder of documents on the counter, and Evelyn's eyes, still glimmering from last night's triumph, fell upon it. "What's this?" she asked, more curious than concerned, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. "Just some follow-ups on the deal," Daniel said, his voice calm. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and watched her with an almost imperceptible intensity. There was no judgment in his tone, only observation, as if he were cataloging her every reaction, every flicker of emotion. Evelyn glanced at the folder, then waved it off. "Nothing I can't handle. Honestly, Daniel, you worry too much. It's all perfectly aligned." She sipped her espresso, eyes scanning the latest news coverage, lauding her for orchestrating a $550 million triumph. In her mind, the narrative was clear. She was the mastermind, untouchable, admired, unstoppable. Daniel said nothing. He merely smiled faintly, a ghost of amusement flickering across his features. Inwardly, he cataloged every detail of the deal, aware that her perception of ownership was merely the tip of the iceberg. He had been the silent force behind the scenes, the unseen hand guiding negotiations, ensuring every clause favored their strategic positioning. Evelyn had orchestrated the public performance. He had orchestrated reality. By midday, Evelyn was in her office, a space flooded with light, adorned with minimalist decor and a collection of contemporary art that screamed success. She paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to her ear, laughing with a potential investor about last night's spectacle. Every gesture was precise, every word deliberate, each carefully designed to impress. Daniel remained at the doorway, observing, his expression unreadable. "You really do enjoy the spotlight," he said softly, almost conversationally. Evelyn turned, a smirk curling on her lips. "And you enjoy the shadows," she replied. Her tone was teasing, but there was an unacknowledged edge to it, a recognition that he moved differently in the world, quieter, subtler, more dangerous than anyone realized. She did not know, and perhaps would never know, the extent of his control over the empire she claimed to dominate. The day unfolded with a series of meetings, emails, and phone calls. Evelyn's assistant scurried to accommodate her every request, while Daniel moved like a shadow among the edges of her world, noting details no one else could perceive. He spotted minor inconsistencies in her contracts, potential vulnerabilities in her partnerships, and minor social slights from colleagues she would never notice. While Evelyn dazzled the world, Daniel ensured the architecture supporting her brilliance was unassailable.
By late afternoon, Evelyn sat at her desk, reviewing the final numbers for the deal. Her phone buzzed with notifications, and she glanced up at Daniel. "Do you see this?" she asked, excitement dancing in her eyes. "Everyone is already talking about how I pulled this off. Daniel, did you see the article in Bloomberg? They practically crowned me queen of the deal." Daniel approached slowly, standing behind her chair. His hand brushed lightly against the back of her seat. "It's impressive," he said, carefully neutral. "But you must remember, appearances can be deceiving. Not everything you celebrate is truly yours. Some victories are collaborative." Evelyn laughed, the sound bright and confident. "Collaborative, yes, but the world sees me as the one in command. That's what matters. Influence is perception, and perception is everything." She leaned back, stretching her arms above her head, a gesture both triumphant and indulgent. Daniel nodded, silently acknowledging her point, but the flicker of calculation in his eyes suggested a layer she had yet to perceive. For him, perception was only one part of the equation. Control, substance, and leverage were the invisible strings that determined the real outcome. Evelyn, immersed in her own narrative, remained oblivious. Late in the evening, Daniel retreated to his private study, a room lined with dark oak bookshelves and softly glowing lamps. He reviewed the contracts in meticulous detail, tracing the web of corporate ownership, shareholder influence, and strategic leverage. Every clause, every subtle term, reinforced what he had always known. The $550 million deal that Evelyn celebrated was ultimately under his control.
He did not gloat, he merely catalogued, prepared for the inevitable day when the truth would surface. Meanwhile, Evelyn prepared for another social engagement, a charity gala where she would once again step into the limelight. She tried on gowns in front of the mirror, rehearsing smiles and conversational hooks for potential donors. She practiced gestures, intonations, and the art of appearing simultaneously approachable and commanding. Daniel lingered in the background, quietly observing, as always. He wondered, not for the first time, how long it would take for her to realize that the strings she believed she held were intertwined with threads of his making. And yet, he did not rush. Part of the power lay in patience, in allowing pride and confidence to bloom fully before the revelation. It was a careful balance, letting her soar, then letting her fall, or adjust according to the truth. That night, as Evelyn stepped out into the city lights, radiant in a gown of deep emerald silk, Daniel remained behind, alone in the quiet of their penthouse. He poured himself a glass of wine, swirling it thoughtfully. The reflection of the skyline shimmered in the glass, fractured and elegant, much like the illusions and realities that intertwined within their lives. Evelyn believed she had orchestrated her triumph. Daniel knew she had only danced upon the stage he had built. And so, behind the scenes, the true dynamics of power and control remained hidden, waiting for the moment when pride, perception, and reality would collide in ways neither of them could fully anticipate. In that quiet, Daniel Harper catalogued, observed, and waited. Evelyn, immersed in brilliance and adoration, had no idea that the game was already moving toward a crescendo she had never imagined.
The days after the dinner party carried an odd stillness. Manhattan streets buzzed as usual, with the relentless pulse of ambition, yellow cabs weaving between glass towers. But inside the Harper penthouse, a subtle tension had begun to settle, like dust in the sunlight. Evelyn Harper moved through her routines with the same precision and polish, yet an unfamiliar unease tugged at her mind. She could not pinpoint it, but small discrepancies began to prick at her consciousness. A misfiled email, a strange glance from an assistant, the faint whiff of something unsettled in her meticulously controlled environment. She had built her empire on clarity and perception. Every deal, every handshake, every smile in public was carefully orchestrated. And yet, for the first time in months, Evelyn felt as though something was moving beneath the surface, invisible but undeniable. It was subtle, a hesitation in a partner's reply, a delay in receiving confirmation, a silence where there had once been swift certainty. The kind of tension that could not be blamed on anyone but the system, or perhaps someone very close. Daniel noticed the shift immediately, of course. He watched her from a distance as she navigated her office, making calls, reviewing contracts, all while her brows knitted just slightly when a document arrived or a message went unanswered. He did not intervene. Suspicion and doubt were delicate instruments, and patience was a tool he wielded better than anyone. Letting her sense the cracks without revealing the foundation beneath them was part of a subtle choreography he had perfected over years. Evelyn sat at her desk late one evening, the skyline outside awash in the cold blue of twilight. Her fingers tapped a rhythmic pattern on the polished glass surface, her mind racing through minor anomalies that had accumulated over the past week. The $550 million deal, which had once seemed a crown jewel of her career, suddenly felt like a puzzle missing a critical piece. She had noticed a peculiar pattern in the emails regarding shareholder approvals, minor corrections in wording, and an odd insistence from legal teams on clauses that she had not requested. It was not enough to raise alarm, yet it was enough to stir unease. Her phone vibrated. A brief text from a junior associate asked about a meeting she hadn't scheduled. Evelyn frowned, reread the message, and then glanced up at Daniel, who had entered silently, as he always did. His presence was a shadow she could feel more than see. "Did you schedule this?" she asked, voice polite but tinged with impatience. "No," he replied calmly, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed. Perhaps someone assumed. He did not elaborate, letting the seed of doubt remain untouched. Evelyn's thoughts spiraled. She had prided herself on mastery over every detail, yet the small inconsistencies were accumulating. Could she have overlooked something in the deal? She replayed the dinner party in her mind, the laughter, the applause, her triumph, and for the first time, a question surfaced that she could not dismiss. Had she truly controlled everything, or merely appeared to? The next morning, she scheduled a private meeting with her legal team. Her posture was impeccable, her tone confident, but beneath the surface, a thread of anxiety tugged at her mind. Documents were scrutinized, contracts revisited, signatures double-checked, and yet nothing overtly amiss surfaced. It should have been reassuring, but it was not. Evelyn left the meeting with a nagging suspicion, a whisper in the back of her mind that she could not name.
Daniel, observing quietly, did not interject. He allowed her to stew in the ambiguity, to taste the faint bitterness of uncertainty. He had seen it before. Pride begins to crack not through confrontation, but through subtle erosion. By letting her question the completeness of her victory, he preserved the integrity of his own position, while sharpening her awareness of the delicate balance between perception and reality. Later that week, Evelyn met with a prominent venture capitalist, Jonathan Pierce, in his sleek office overlooking the East River. She spoke with her usual charisma, recounting the intricate strategies she had supposedly masterminded. Yet Jonathan's questions, precise and probing, struck a chord of doubt. "Evelyn," he said, tilting his head thoughtfully, "the structure behind this deal, it's impressive, but there are layers of ownership here that are unusual. Did you personally negotiate those?" Evelyn froze for a heartbeat, searching for a confident response. "Of course," she replied, voice firm but slightly clipped, forcing a laugh that did not quite settle the tension. The question lingered in her mind long after the meeting concluded, like a shadow stretching across a sunlit floor. Back at home, Daniel quietly observed her agitation, noting how she furrowed her brow while reviewing financial summaries, how she paced between the living room and her study, muttering under her breath. He did not correct her misperception, he merely cataloged it. There was a quiet satisfaction in watching her begin to sense that control and perception were not always synonymous. One evening, as rain tapped lightly against the windows, Evelyn found herself alone in the study, documents spread across the desk, scrutinizing every clause of the deal. A nagging intuition pressed against her pride. She had believed she controlled the narrative, that the accolades and media coverage were proof of her dominion. Now, subtle hints suggested otherwise. Emails had been sent from addresses she did not recognize. Minor corrections she had not requested had been implemented. The feeling of unease was no longer abstract. It had become tangible. Daniel entered silently, as he always did, standing behind her chair without a sound. Evelyn sensed him but did not turn immediately, lost in her growing suspicion. "You're quiet tonight. Is there something you're not telling me?" His lips curved in a faint, enigmatic smile. "Perhaps. But some truths are best discovered slowly." His words carried no threat, only a measured suggestion that the narrative she trusted might not be complete. Evelyn's heart skipped imperceptibly. She could not decide whether to feel relieved or wary. The night stretched on, filled with the hum of the city below and the low, unspoken tension in the apartment. Evelyn reviewed contracts, cross-referenced emails, and tried to trace ownership structures herself. Yet the more she examined, the more the pieces seemed to shift just out of reach. Doubt, once a faint whisper, had grown into a persistent presence, intruding into her thoughts, her confidence, her sense of mastery. As she finally leaned back in her chair, exhausted, she realized that the sensation was unsettling not only because it challenged her authority, but because she could not pinpoint its origin. Every instinct told her to regain control, yet every clue suggested she was only scratching the surface of something far larger. Daniel, standing behind her in the dim lamplight, watched silently. He did not speak.
He allowed her doubt to bloom, understanding that sometimes the most effective power was the one perceived, but not yet revealed. In the quiet, Evelyn Harper understood, for the first time, that the world she thought she dominated might be more complex than she had ever imagined. And in that realization, the first true fracture of certainty appeared, a fracture Daniel had anticipated all along, patiently waiting for the moment when perception and reality would begin to collide.
It was a crisp morning, the kind where the air in Manhattan carried a hint of autumn, even as the sun shone brightly. Evelyn Harper sat at her office desk, a pristine mahogany slab littered with contracts, spreadsheets, and a small stack of legal correspondence. Her fingers hovered over a fresh email from her law firm. Subject line innocuous, clarification on ownership structure. She clicked it open, expecting the usual routine confirmation. Instead, she found herself staring at a document that made her heart stall, her pulse thundering in her ears. The spreadsheet listed shareholders, percentages, and intricate layers of ownership she had never encountered. And then, in a line that seemed to blur the world around her, primary ownership, Daniel Harper, 100% controlling interest. Evelyn blinked, thinking she had misread. She scrolled back and forth, rereading every clause, every note, every footnote. Daniel Harper, the man she had teased, humiliated, and underestimated, owned the very company behind the $550 million deal she had believed to be hers. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her carefully curated composure. Her mind raced through the timeline, replaying the dinner party, her triumphant smile, the applause, and the subtle hints she had ignored. The wine, the laughter, the guests, all of it suddenly cast in a new, uncomfortable light. She had performed, danced in the spotlight, while the architect of the stage had been silently orchestrating every move, watching her with the patience of a master strategist. A cold realization settled over her. For all her brilliance, all her ambition, she had been blind to the most crucial detail. The one person she thought passive was in fact entirely in control. Her first instinct was disbelief. No, it couldn't be. She had closed the deal, negotiated terms, charmed investors. How could she have missed this? Daniel entered the office silently, as was his habit, closing the door behind him with a soft click. Evelyn spun around, eyes wide, a mixture of shock, anger, and awe flashing across her face. Daniel. Her voice was unsteady, but the accusation hung in the air. This says you own it. You own the company. You own everything. He approached slowly, his posture calm, measured. It's not about owning, he said softly. It's about perspective. You believed you controlled the deal because you controlled the narrative. You dazzled investors, impressed the board, convinced yourself of your own supremacy. But ownership is not perception. It's substance. Evelyn's mind reeled. But I signed the contracts. I negotiated the terms. I brought the investors in. I did everything. Daniel shook his head, his expression unreadable yet tinged with a quiet pride. You did everything visible, yes. But the foundation, the leverage, the real decision-making, those were already in place. I ensured the framework allowed for your brilliance to shine while safeguarding the outcome.
Her chest heaved as she tried to process the enormity of the revelation. Every detail of her recent triumph, the dinner party, the media coverage, her sense of invincibility, was suddenly undercut by the knowledge that she had not been the sole architect. She had been celebrated for success she believed was entirely hers, yet the invisible hand behind it all had been Daniel's. The humiliation, subtle but undeniable, washed over her. She had mocked him, poured wine on him during the party, flaunted her confidence before the world, all while blind to the fact that the man she had demeaned was silently controlling the very stage she performed on. Evelyn's pride, so carefully honed, now felt like a fragile mask slipping from her face. Daniel observed her quietly, giving her space to process, to confront the fracture between perception and reality. I never sought to diminish you. You have brilliance, charisma, the ability to inspire.
But brilliance without understanding is vulnerable. I merely ensured that the outcome we needed was secure while letting you believe you led the charge. Evelyn sank into her chair, pressing a hand to her forehead. I thought I was untouchable, she murmured, almost to herself. The words were a confession, a recognition of the vulnerability she had ignored, the arrogance she had nurtured. I thought I controlled everything, and I didn't see it. Daniel knelt beside her chair, not touching, not intruding, simply present. Control is rarely absolute. Sometimes it is the quiet forces, the unseen hands that shape reality most effectively. Pride can blind even the most perceptive. Tears, unexpected, bitter, welled in Evelyn's eyes. She realized, painfully, that the world she had believed she dominated was partially constructed by another, a man she had thought passive, compliant, harmless. And yet in that moment of vulnerability, she recognized not betrayal, but a kind of protection, a meticulous orchestration that had preserved the deal, her reputation, and their shared ambitions. Her mind spiraled through a montage of memories, the wine, the laughter, the guests' applause, her confident words, and she understood the subtle brilliance of Daniel's approach. He had let her perform, let her shine, let her believe in her own invincibility, while the real power had quietly secured their success behind the scenes. Evelyn's anger, initially sharp and stinging, softened into awe. Her eyes met his, searching for the man behind the revelation, trying to reconcile the teasing, almost invisible partner she had known with the master strategist before her. All this time, you let me believe, she vertical. Daniel smiled faintly, a mixture of warmth and quiet triumph. I let you believe because you needed to. Sometimes the lesson arrives not through confrontation, but revelation. The real strength of a person is tested when the illusion is lifted. Evelyn sank into her chair, exhaling slowly. The room felt simultaneously smaller and larger, the weight of the revelation settling into her chest. Pride, shame, awe, and gratitude intermingled in a tangled knot. She had been celebrated, humiliated, and enlightened all at once. For the first time, she truly saw Daniel, not as the supportive, understated husband she had teased, but as a complex force of patience, strategy, and quiet power. And in that recognition, a subtle shift occurred within her, a blend of respect, curiosity, and an unspoken acknowledgement that the dynamics of control, perception, and love were far more intricate than she had imagined. The $550 million deal, once a symbol of her solitary brilliance, now represented a shared triumph, layered with the revelation of unseen orchestration, patience, and subtle authority. Evelyn's world had tilted, and yet in that tilt she found clarity, an understanding that perception and reality often diverge, and that power sometimes resides in the quiet, invisible hands that guide events from the shadows. That evening, as Manhattan glittered beneath a canopy of lights, Evelyn Harper sat alone at her desk with the documents spread before her and allowed herself a moment of reflection. The revelation had struck like lightning bolt, but within it she discovered the beginning of humility, respect, and a deeper comprehension of both love and power. And for the first time in months, she felt the stirrings of genuine awe for the man beside her, the man she had underestimated, the man who had quietly owned everything she had celebrated.
The Harper penthouse felt unusually silent that evening. The city outside glittered with the usual hum of life, but inside, every shadow seemed amplified, every soft click of heels or distant car horn carrying more weight than normal. Evelyn sat at the long dining table, the remnants of dinner pushed aside, her hands clasped tightly together. The realization from the previous day still throbbed in her chest, the truth of Daniel's control a persistent echo that refused to fade. Daniel entered, as he always did, with calm precision. His gaze swept the room, taking in the dim lighting, the wine glasses still catching reflections of the chandelier, and finally, Evelyn herself. He closed the door behind him softly, leaving no sound to disturb the fragile tension in the air. Evelyn rose from her chair, her posture straight, a mask of composed authority slipping slightly at the edges. "Daniel," she began, her voice steady, yet carrying a subtle tremor. "We need to talk." Daniel nodded, his expression neutral but attentive. "We always do," he said softly, moving closer to stand by the sideboard.
Evelyn paced a few steps before facing him fully. Yesterday, the revelation, the ownership of the company, the deal, everything, she said, her voice rising slightly, then falling into controlled calm. I don't understand. How could you let me believe that I controlled it all, that I orchestrated the $550 million deal? Daniel remained still, hands folded loosely behind his back. Because sometimes it's necessary for people to believe they are in control, to see their own strengths. You would have been distracted by doubt or insecurity if I had intervened directly, and you would not have performed as brilliantly as you did at the dinner party. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind struggling to reconcile pride, anger, and shock. She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Performed brilliantly, she echoed. I mocked you. I poured wine on you in front of our colleagues, humiliated you for their amusement, and all the while you controlled everything behind the scenes. Daniel's gaze softened, not with guilt but with measured patience. Yes, you were spectacular. That's what I needed you to see. Your own brilliance, your ability to influence, persuade, and captivate. But power is not just performance. It's preparation, foresight, and the ability to act when no one is watching. Evelyn's chest rose and fell rapidly. She ran a hand through her hair, struggling to find words. So everything I thought I achieved on my own, it wasn't mine? Daniel stepped closer, his tone calm but firm, cutting through her whirlwind of emotion. It was yours in every visible way. You earned respect, admiration, even the envy of our peers. But the reality, the structure, the leverage, was carefully maintained to ensure our success. You were never diminished. You were protected, guided, and given room to shine. Evelyn's fingers clenched and unclenched, her pride battling the undeniable truth. Protected, guided, or controlled? Daniel met her gaze evenly, his expression revealing nothing beyond subtle insistence. Controlled implies coercion. I provided structure and foresight. You made choices, led negotiations, dazzled investors, and charmed the media. The decisions you made were real and the victories are yours. But the framework that allowed them to flourish, yes, that was designed carefully. For us. Together. For a moment, Evelyn's anger flared, a sudden blaze that threatened to consume reason. She took a step back, lowering her voice but intensifying her words with a sharp edge. You let me parade through Manhattan thinking I was untouchable. You let me humiliate you publicly? Do you realize what that feels like?
Daniel's expression softened further. He crossed the room slowly, placing a hand gently on hers, not to pacify, but to anchor the moment. I do, and I understand it fully. But let me ask you this. Would you have been as formidable if you had known the full extent of the control from the beginning, or would fear, doubt, and second-guessing have overshadowed your brilliance? Evelyn's eyes glistened, caught between tears and revelation. Her chest heaved as she considered the truth of his words. He had let her operate in the spotlight, believing she held the power, while he ensured the outcome was secure. The indignation, the embarrassment, the pride, it all collided into a single dizzying moment of awareness. She shook her head, incredulous. So, I was just performing. Her voice faltered. Dancing on a stage you built for me? Daniel's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. You were dancing, yes, but you did it beautifully, and your performance had impact beyond what you realized. I did not diminish you. I amplified your strengths while maintaining the stability that ensured our shared success. Evelyn sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The room seemed to shrink, the weight of revelation pressing in from all sides. She had always believed that brilliance, ambition, and charm would be enough, and now she understood that they were, alone, insufficient. True power required not only perception, but foundation, foresight, and patience. She looked up at Daniel, vulnerability etched into her features. I don't know if I feel relief or betrayal, she admitted, her voice trembling. I thought I was untouchable, and now I realized how much I missed. Daniel knelt slightly, his hands resting on the arms of her chair, his gaze steady.
Feel both if you must, but remember this: you are formidable, intelligent, and brilliant. The realization does not diminish your achievements, it adds context. You performed magnificently under the assumption of control, and that is no small feat. Evelyn's chest heaved as she absorbed the words, the storm of emotion slowly calming into a profound awareness. She realized that her anger and pride were valid, yet the admiration she felt for Daniel now mingled with a newfound respect. He had orchestrated not only the company but also the circumstances that allowed her to fully express her talents, even if it meant she had unknowingly danced on a stage he had built. The room fell into a quiet, shared space, heavy with the weight of understanding. Daniel's calm presence, once almost invisible, now carried a profound authority, a reminder that strength and power need not always be visible to be real. Evelyn, for the first time, felt the simultaneous sting and clarity of humility, awe, and recognition. I underestimated you, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible but imbued with sincerity. And I see now. Daniel smiled, gently, without condescension. And now we move forward, with awareness, respect, and perhaps a little more honesty between us. The game is not about dominance alone. It is about understanding, timing, and partnership. Evelyn nodded slowly, her fingers brushing against his as a tentative bridge. The confrontation had revealed fractures, yes, but it had also illuminated the subtle architecture of trust, strategy, and shared purpose. The humiliation, the shock, and the awe blended into a singular, poignant understanding. True power, often unseen, is far more compelling than the visible victories it enables. And in that moment, Manhattan outside continued its relentless rhythm, indifferent, yet beautiful, while inside the Harper penthouse, the dynamics of pride, perception, and partnership shifted quietly, irrevocably, and with profound resonance.
The city seemed unchanged the morning after the confrontation, yet within the walls of the Harper penthouse, everything had shifted. Manhattan streets carried the usual rhythm, cabs honking, pedestrians weaving hurriedly, the hum of commerce, but Evelyn Harper felt detached from it all, as if observing from behind a thick glass. The revelation, the confrontation, and the uneasy respect she had developed for Daniel now left her mind spinning with questions, doubts, and a fragile sense of clarity. She wandered through the apartment in silence, the polished surfaces reflecting not just the skyline, but the storm of thought that swirled within her. For the first time in years, Evelyn Harper was acutely aware of her own vulnerability. The public accolades and personal triumphs that had once defined her were no longer sufficient to anchor her sense of self. The realization that the deal she had celebrated as her masterpiece was in truth guided, controlled, and ultimately owned by her husband left a lingering ache, a complex mix of awe, frustration, and humility. Daniel, ever precise in his movements, prepared breakfast with the same quiet competence he brought to every aspect of their lives. He did not speak unless necessary, allowing the silence to settle like a third presence in the room. Evelyn watched him, noting the calm authority in his actions, the ease with which he moved, the quiet assurance that had carried him through every intricate negotiation, every calculated move, every unseen maneuver. For all her brilliance and public dominance, she could not help but marvel at the subtlety of his influence. Her mind returned to the documents she had examined the night before, contracts, shareholder structures, and clauses meticulously designed to secure control. Each line now seemed less like legal jargon and more like an intricate puzzle she had only partially solved. She understood, viscerally, that Daniel's patience had allowed her to shine while ensuring the foundations of their empire remained unshakable. The realization brought both relief and a sting of embarrassment. She had underestimated him, mocked him, and yet he had safeguarded everything she believed she had conquered. By mid-morning, Evelyn sat at her desk, a cup of untouched coffee cooling beside her. She reviewed emails from colleagues who remained blissfully unaware of the deeper truth behind the deal. She noticed minor mistakes she had overlooked in her previous excitement. Small details she now understood were part of Daniel's silent corrections. Each one reminded her of how finely balanced their world was, how easily perception could diverge from reality. Daniel entered quietly, leaning against the doorframe as he always did, his presence both grounding and probing. "You're quiet today," he observed, voice measured. Evelyn did not respond immediately, staring at a spreadsheet as if seeing it for the first time with unfiltered eyes. "I've been thinking," she said finally, her voice low, almost hesitant. "About the deal, about everything, about us. I realized how much I relied on perception, on appearances, on the applause of others, and I took for granted the subtle power that really shapes outcomes."
Daniel nodded, not interrupting. Awareness is the first step. Control is the next, but it is not always what it seems. True power often operates quietly, invisibly, until it is tested. You've experienced that firsthand. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, eyes closed for a moment, exhaling slowly. She recalled the wine incident at the dinner party, her laughter, the mockery she had displayed without realizing the depth of Daniel's patience. She felt a flush of shame, mixed with understanding. He had allowed her the freedom to express herself fully, confident that he could manage the consequences. The thought was both humbling and infuriating, a bitter acknowledgement that her autonomy had been subtly framed by another's foresight. The afternoon brought calls and meetings, the usual demands of business pressing in, but Evelyn found herself responding differently. Where she once relied solely on charisma and assertiveness, she now paused, considered, and measured each action with a new awareness of unseen forces. She began to recognize that success was not merely the product of visible brilliance, but also the careful orchestration of underlying structures, relationships, and strategic patience. Later, she took a walk along the Hudson River, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs. The city shimmered in the late afternoon sun, reflections dancing on the water's surface. Evelyn allowed herself to think about the lessons embedded in the confrontation. She realized that anger and pride, though powerful, could cloud judgment. Humility and understanding, though uncomfortable, offered clarity, and trust, though fraught with vulnerability, created the possibility for partnership that transcended superficial victories. Returning to the apartment, she found Daniel reviewing financial summaries in his study. He glanced up as she entered, acknowledging her presence without words. She walked over, standing beside him, and for the first time they shared a silent understanding, a moment where pride, acknowledgement, and respect converged. "I underestimated you," she said quietly, almost as a confession. "Not just in business, but in patience, in foresight, in understanding how power really works." Daniel smiled faintly, a mixture of warmth and quiet triumph. "We underestimate things all the time, Evelyn. It's part of being human. What matters is how we respond once the truth becomes clear." Evelyn nodded, absorbing the weight of his words. The lessons were clear, yet the emotional resonance lingered. She had confronted both external perception and internal pride, and in doing so, she had begun to navigate the subtle currents of power that Daniel had quietly mastered. The revelation did not diminish her achievements, it reframed them, adding depth, complexity, and a newfound respect for the dynamics of partnership and control. That night, the city lights reflected off the penthouse windows, glittering like a constellation that existed both outside and within. Evelyn Harper sat quietly, reviewing the deal, tracing the layers of ownership, and contemplating the lessons of the past days. The confrontation, once a source of shock and anger, had transformed into an opportunity for reflection, growth, and understanding. Daniel joined her, standing silently as she studied the documents. Their eyes met, and in that gaze was a mixture of acknowledgement, respect, and unspoken collaboration. The revelation, confrontation, and aftermath had altered the landscape of their relationship, embedding a deeper awareness, a subtle recalibration of trust, and a recognition that true power, patience, and partnership often operate beneath the surface, invisible yet indispensable. As Manhattan continued its relentless rhythm outside, Evelyn felt a quiet shift within, a recognition that the world she inhabited was layered, intricate, and far more complex than her previous understanding. And in that complexity lay opportunity, understanding, and a fragile but profound respect for the man who had guided her, challenged her, and revealed the true dimensions of both power and partnership.
The dawn light seeped gently through the tall windows of the Harper penthouse, brushing against the polished floors and casting long shadows across the minimalist furnishings. Manhattan had already begun its daily symphony of movement, yellow cabs honking, pedestrians chatting, delivery trucks rumbling. But inside, the world of Evelyn and Daniel Harper moved at a slower, quieter pace. The storm of revelations, confrontations, and reflections had settled, leaving in its wake a fragile but undeniable clarity. Evelyn sat at the edge of the living room sofa, her hands loosely clasped, eyes staring out at the city skyline as if trying to read the narrative of her own life and its flickering lights. For weeks, she had navigated the intoxicating heights of professional triumph, only to have her perception violently shaken by Daniel's quiet mastery. The $550 million deal, once a symbol of her brilliance alone, had been reframed, a shared triumph, a lesson in humility, and a revelation about the unseen forces that shaped her world. Her mind wandered back through the sequence of events, the wine at the dinner party, her laughter, her mockery. It all seemed almost dreamlike now, tinged with both embarrassment and understanding. She remembered the sharp sting and humiliation, the flush of pride, and then the creeping uncertainty that had gnawed at her during the days of subtle suspicion. And finally, she recalled the confrontation, the moment when truth, patience, and perception collided. Daniel's presence beside her was quiet, almost invisible, yet profoundly grounding. He had mastered the art of influence without domination, of shaping outcomes without intrusion, of letting someone shine while safeguarding the structure beneath. Evelyn's awareness of this subtle orchestration brought a mix of awe and reluctant admiration. She realized that power and brilliance, while seductive, were insufficient without insight, patience, and understanding of the unseen mechanics that govern the outcomes. "You've been quiet," Daniel said softly, his voice breaking the silence without shattering its contemplative atmosphere. Evelyn turned toward him, her gaze lingering on the familiar features she had teased, tested, and underestimated. "I've been reflecting," she admitted. "It's strange, you know? I thought I had everything figured out, my deals, my image, my success. And yet I was blind to what was right in front of me." Daniel nodded, eyes steady. "Perception often lulls us into confidence. It's not a failing, but a part of being human. The important thing is what we do with the clarity once it comes." Evelyn's lips curved into a tentative smile, a mixture of self-recognition and acceptance. She thought about the lessons embedded in every moment of humiliation, doubt, and revelation. The wine, the mockery, the confrontation, they were not merely trials, but mirrors reflecting the complexity of pride, power, and partnership. She understood now that her brilliance had been magnified by her freedom to perform, while Daniel's subtle control ensured the stability and ultimate success of their shared enterprise. "Do you ever regret letting me think I was in control?" she asked, her voice softer now, tinged with curiosity rather than accusation. Daniel's smile was faint, almost enigmatic. "Regret is unnecessary. You performed magnificently. You learned. And perhaps in seeing the invisible scaffolding, you've gained something more valuable than triumph alone. Perspective."
Evelyn nodded slowly. The words resonated deeply. Perspective. The awareness that victory, power, and influence were often a delicate balance between perception and reality, between visibility and the hidden architecture of strategy.
She realized that understanding this balance was not merely a professional lesson, but a personal one, shaping how she would navigate relationships, ambition, and love moving forward. The afternoon light shifted, bathing the room in warm hues. Evelyn walked toward the balcony, gazing down at the streets below. Manhattan thrived, indifferent yet breathtaking in its scale and complexity. She felt a kinship with the city, both vibrant and ruthless, beautiful yet layered with unseen dynamics. Her own life mirrored that pattern, and she understood now that mastery was not simply about dominance, but about awareness, patience, and measured action. Daniel joined her quietly, standing close yet without intrusion. They shared a moment of silence, the kind that carried more meaning than words ever could. Evelyn felt the intertwining of pride, respect, and connection, the subtle threads of partnership that had been tested, strained, and ultimately strengthened through the trials of the past weeks. "I suppose I have to thank you," she said finally, her voice steady yet carrying emotion. "For patience, for guidance, and for letting me realize what I didn't see." Daniel's eyes softened, and he reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. "You earned every bit of this lesson," he said, "not through blind obedience or reliance, but through brilliance, courage, and resilience. I merely ensured the stage remained intact for you to shine. That's all anyone can do for someone worth the effort." Evelyn's chest lifted with a mix of relief and awe. She felt the lingering sting of past arrogance, the faint embarrassment of her public mockery, but now these sensations were tempered by understanding. The journey through suspicion, confrontation, and reflection had illuminated the subtle choreography of control, trust, and partnership that defined not just their marriage and business, but the intricate world they inhabited. As evening approached, the city lights flickered on, casting a soft glow across the apartment. Evelyn and Daniel moved to sit together, side by side, watching Manhattan breathe and pulse beneath them. Words were unnecessary. The silence carried meaning, a shared acknowledgement of lessons learned, perspective shifted, and the quiet strength that comes from understanding both visible and invisible forces. Evelyn thought about the future, the $550 million deal, the empire they had nurtured, and the complex dance of perception and reality that would continue to shape their lives. She recognized that success was not merely a product of individual brilliance, but of subtle collaboration, foresight, and the ability to see beyond immediate appearances. Finally, she turned to Daniel, a calm determination settling in her gaze. She said, "We move forward, with awareness, respect, and partnership." Daniel nodded, a quiet smile acknowledging both her growth and the shared understanding between them. "Exactly." And with the knowledge that sometimes the most profound power lies not in being seen, but in what is quietly built and carefully preserved. Evelyn leaned back, allowing herself a moment of satisfaction, not the shallow triumph of public recognition, but the deeper, richer sense of clarity and wisdom born from challenge, revelation, and reflection. She had faced humiliation, doubt, and revelation. She had confronted truth and emerged with perspective. And now, in the quiet of their penthouse overlooking Manhattan, she felt a sense of resolution, a subtle but unshakable understanding that power, perception, and partnership were intertwined, complex, and profoundly human. Together they sat in silence, watching the city pulse below, the trials behind them, the lessons clear, and the future unfolding with quiet promise. Evelyn Harper knew she had grown, not merely as a businesswoman or a strategist, but as a person capable of understanding the delicate balance between pride and humility, visibility and subtlety, ambition and collaboration. And in that understanding, she found peace, clarity, and the faint but powerful thrill of genuine insight. The city moved on, indifferent and relentless, while inside the Harper penthouse, two people understood each other more fully than ever before. Partners not just in marriage or business, but in navigating the subtle, complex architecture of life itself.